Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Well, today we're going to take a look at the Queen Mother and Queen Elizabeth's father, George VI. They were a devoted couple, but Bertie had to be really persistent to get Elizabeth to marry him. And once they did marry, their love grew, and they were great partners for each other. And watching the King's speech showed what a loving relationship they shared, and this made me want to find out more about them, so let us take a look at them now. Bertie found his true love. When Bertie, then known as Prince Albert, Duke of York, was at a dinner party in 1920, it was then that he first met Elizabeth. The party included Queen Mary, Princess Mary, and Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, on Derby night. And George V hosted a lavish celebratory dinner at Buckingham Palace. Later that evening, a ball was held with the same party, and Albert went up to a fellow attendee, James Stewart, and asked, "Who was that lovely girl you were talking to? Introduce me to her." So her name was Elizabeth, and she was 19 years old and the daughter of the Earl of Strathmore. She grew up at Glamis Castle in Angus, Scotland, and she was the 9th child out of 10, and she had a very close relationship with her family. Well, the facts of the introduction between them isn't known, but they were to see each other at another ball soon after. And when the war was over, the Strathmores introduced their daughter to the court. Elizabeth debuted on July 15th before George V and Queen Mary. She was an instant hit thanks to her bubbly personality, inherent kindness, and the allure of her large and welcoming family. At the time that Albert was starting to see Elizabeth, she was being courted by James Stewart, and that was Albert's equerry, and then he left the prince's service for a better paid job in the American oil business. So Albert was charmed by her, and he made sure he visited Glamis frequently, and that he had social events lined up for them to go to. Soon Albert had fallen in love with Elizabeth, and he proposed to her, but she declined. Why did she turn him down? Well, there was a few theories. One was that she had a number of suitors and wasn't ready to settle down. Another was that she didn't want to give up her freedom by marrying into a royal family with public responsibilities. The rejection didn't seem to have an effect on their relationship, and they continued to see each other. And the following September, Albert returned to Glamis with Queen Mary. After meeting Elizabeth and her family properly, she became more convinced than ever that this was the one girl who could make Bertie happy. In February of 1922, Albert and Elizabeth were brought together once again by two royal weddings. One was for his sister Mary. And I guess after witnessing all those weddings, Albert decided to propose to Elizabeth once again. He was probably hoping that she would catch wedding fever, but he was disappointed when she turned him down again. And he was also disillusioned, and he worked throughout the summer because he had been in love with her for 2 years, and he decided to go see her in the fall at Glamis. So there was a false story in the newspaper at this time that Elizabeth didn't want to marry Albert because she wanted his brother David more. This made Elizabeth angry. It wasn't true. After the article came out, Albert decided to ask Elizabeth one more time. Albert told the Duchess of Devonshire that he was going to try his hand once more. "This is the last time I'm going to propose to her. It's the third time, and it's going to be the last." So you can't blame him for saying that. And this time, Elizabeth agreed, thanks in part to her brother. He said, "You can't keep him in limbo. It isn't fair to him." So that helped her make her decision. So it was then that Albert telegraphed a message to his parents saying, "All right, Bertie." Queen Mary wrote in her diary a few days later, once the couple had visited, "We are delighted, and he looks beaming." I'm sure Albert's dad was happy with the news too, because he had told Bertie earlier, "You'll be a lucky fellow if she accepts you." And then Bertie wrote a sweet letter to Lady Arline, who had long championed him, to Elizabeth and to the rest of the royal family. So Bertie wrote to her, "How can I thank you enough for your charming letter to me about the wonderful happening in my life which has come to pass, and my dream which has at last been realized? It seems so marvelous to me to know that my darling Elizabeth will one day be my wife. We are both very, very happy, and I'm sure always will be. I owe so much to you, and can hardly only bless you for what you did." So they were married April 26th in 1923 at Westminster Abbey. It wasn't an extravagant wedding because it was thought that Bertie was never going to take the throne. And after the wedding, they had a wedding breakfast at Buckingham Palace prepared by the chef Gabrielle Shume, and then they honeymooned at Pauliston Lacey, a manor house in Surrey, and then went to Scotland. Unfortunately, while they were in Scotland, Elizabeth got the whooping cough. In the early days of their marriage, Sally Bedell Smith, who wrote a book, George VI and Elizabeth, The Marriage That Shaped the Monarchy, said that when she researched Bertie and Elizabeth, she was surprised to find out that they liked to party. She found diaries where it was noted they would go out dancing until 3 or 4 in the morning, and she, Elizabeth, would say, fell asleep at 5 a.m. and got up for a brekkie late. Bertie and David were close as brothers during this time, and Elizabeth got along with him too. The three of them would go out and party. Historian Andrew Lowney, who authored Trader King, told Express.co.uk, Bertie was happy to stay under the radar, and the men remained close throughout the 20s. The Duke and Duchess of York, after their marriage in 1923, regularly visited David at his home at Fort Belvedere in Windsor Great Park. So next they took a trip to Africa. In June 1924, Albert and Elizabeth were at a dinner party, and Winston Churchill was seated next to them. And he started talking about a trip to Africa he made 17 years before. He mentioned that the couple, they were young and they should think about going there for a visit because they were young and needed to take a look at the world. And he also said that East Africa was going to have a great future. At that time, Bertie was 28 and Elizabeth 24. And they were both a bit nervous and excited about the 2-week trip by boat to Mombasa, Kenya. And that was the first stop on their 4-month tour. And Elizabeth wrote in her diaries, it was the best bit of one's life. And they took a train ride to Nairobi, and they got to see the natural wonders of East Africa. Bertie wrote to George V, absolutely wild country, untouched as yet by man. Then they got to take a seat in front of the engine of the train to see exotic animals in the wild for the first time, zebra, hartebeest, ostrich, baboons, and the wildebeest. Then they went to Muthagen Club, which was a low-slung pink stucco set among broad lawns and fiscus trees. They danced and dined among the aristocratic English colonials. Bertie went horseback riding on Christmas Eve, and at the church service the next day, the Duke and Duchess of York heard God Save the King sung in Swahili. After that, they started living in the rough for 3 months. They took 3 separate journeys through Kenya, Uganda, and the Sudan. And while they were there, they had 2 white hunters who were experienced in big game, and they would go hunting. And they were at a base camp at first, but then later they went tracking the game and slept in tents. The trip was good for Bertie. Elizabeth said he lost his nervousness and he enjoyed the safari life. Elizabeth wrote to her sister May, it's so difficult to write one's impressions. I've had so many that everything has got blurred into a large whole. But Africa is not as African as one imagines, and very often it is like a very large Scotland, especially in the soft evening light. So next up, Bertie has to speak. Bertie was extremely anxious about giving a speech. The Prince of Wales had made a speech the year before. It was a new thing, and the speech was distributed through speakers and transmitted through the radio for the first time to listeners throughout Britain. David was overseas the year after his first speech, so Prince Albert was named president of the exhibition, and he was to introduce his father just as his older brother had. Elizabeth didn't accompany him to that speech. She stayed home and listened on the radio. The crowd was enormous, about 100,000 spectators. Everyone became quiet, and then the Duke of York prepared to speak on stage. Bertie wrote he was nervous in the legs and not in my mouth or throat. Bertie made it through, telling his brother, it was an ordeal, but I came out of it all right. The king confided to Prince George that Bertie got through his speech all right, but there was some rather long pauses. Then, on October 31st, 1925, he gave a speech closing the ceremony of the British Empire exhibition at Wembley. His speech was less formal. The king and queen weren't there, and he spoke less than 400 words. It took over 3 minutes. In the crowd was an Australian speech therapist, Lionel Logue. Lionel turned to his son to say, he's too old for me to manage a complete cure, but I could very nearly do it. I'm sure of that. Well, Bertie was skeptical about having therapy because all his previous attempts didn't work out. Elizabeth convinced him to give it one more try, and he went to his first therapy October the 19th, 1926. They spent 90 minutes together. Bertie brought up a traumatic memory. When he was in Osborne, he was asked a question by a math teacher, and he had been struck dumb and unable to say the word quarter. Logue said his condition was curable, but he would have to make a tremendous effort. So Bertie left with hope, according to Logue. So for the next 2.5 months, Bertie visited Logue nearly every day. The hour-long session required breathing lessons to control and strengthen his diaphragm, gargling with warm water, repeating vowel sounds while standing by an open window, and practicing tongue-twisting phrases. Elizabeth went so she could see what the regime was and duplicate it at home. And the King's Speech movie showed how they worked together to get rid of the stuttering. Logue didn't call the Duke Bertie, and he didn't say curse words either. So I'll end the video here. The next video will be about Bertie and Elizabeth in the later years of their marriage. So it was interesting to see the early days of the relationship and how it led to marriage and their first years together, and the exciting time with their tour in Kenya being a memory of a lifetime. Well, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it will help with the YouTube algorithm and allow more people to see the video, and it'll also give me an idea if you like the video. So I also hope that everybody has been having a good day, and tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you.